They were helping. He realized that, in many ways, the impact he could make here was even more significant than the personal triumph of Everest. Here, there was a chance to change lives, to bring light to places that had long been in the dark. As the project began to gain traction, Daniel saw the same shift in his heart that had occurred on the mountain. It wasn't about proving anything anymore. The joy of the journey had become the reward itself. And just as Everest had once felt like an unachievable goal, this project, once an overwhelming challenge, began to feel possible. Not because of luck or external circumstances, but because of his unrelenting commitment to see it through. The people in the villages he worked with began to feel a renewed sense of hope. They saw the solar panels being installed, the power flickering too, life in their homes for the first time. And with each small victory, Daniel was reminded that the climb was never just about the destination. It was about making progress, no matter how small, and finding meaning in every step forward. When the first village finally had its first night, fully powered by renewable energy, Daniel stood there, watching the lights flicker on, and for the first time in a long while, he realized he had climbed another mountain. It wasn't made of rock and snow, but it had tested him just as much as Everest had. And this time, the summit wasn't just a moment of personal glory. It was a collective achievement, something bigger than himself. As the project continued to grow, Daniel found himself at peace in a way he had never anticipated. He had come to understand something essential. The climb, the journey, the struggle, these were not isolated events. They were threads woven into the fabric of his life, shaping who he was and how he would face every challenge that came his way. He had always thought of success as something finite, something to be achieved and then celebrated. But the real success was in the climb itself. It was in the strength to endure, the courage to rise after falling, and the willingness to keep moving forward no matter how difficult the path. Daniel stood on the rooftop of a building overlooking one of the villages that had been powered by the initiative, the sun dipping below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. He had come far from the man who had first set foot on Everest. In many ways, he had climbed an even more difficult mountain, the mountain of the heart, of purpose, and of the deep understanding that true success is not a destination. It is the ongoing journey, step by step. He smiled to himself, watching the soft glow of lights below. There would always be more mountains to climb, but now Daniel was no longer afraid. Every summit, every goal was just another beginning, and he was ready to face whatever came next with the same resolve he had found in the snow and ice. Because the greatest journey of all is not about reaching the peak. It's about learning to rise, no matter how high or steep the climb. The wind howled against the jagged cliffs, carrying with it the whispers of those who had come before. Some had conquered the mountain, others had been swallowed by its unforgiving slopes. But for Daniel Carter, standing at the base of Everest, this was more than a climb. It was the culmination of a lifetime of struggle, failure, and relentless perseverance. He tightened his gloves, his breath visible in the freezing air, the weight of his backpack pressed against his shoulders. But the true burden he carried was invisible, the weight of his past. He wasn't just climbing a mountain, he was proving to himself that he was more than the doubts that had haunted him his entire life. Daniel had never been the strongest, the fastest, or the smartest. He was an ordinary man with an extraordinary dream. From childhood, he had been fascinated by stories of explorers, of men and women who had defied the odds to stand where no one else had. But his own journey had been one of failure. He had dropped out of college, struggled through dead-end jobs, and faced ridicule from those who told him he would never amount to anything. His family had begged him to find stability. Friends had laughed at his obsession with Everest. "You? A climber?" they had mocked. "You can't even run a mile without gasping for air." And they had been right, at least at the time. But Daniel had something they couldn't see, an unshakable fire burning inside him. Years of training had led to this moment. He had climbed smaller peaks, suffered frostbite, and learned to push his body beyond its limits. He had sold his car, his furniture, and everything he owned to fund this final journey. And now, as he stood at Everest's base camp, he knew there was no turning back. His guide, Tenzing, a seasoned Sherpa with deep-set eyes and a quiet strength, clapped him on the shoulder. "We start tomorrow," he said. "Rest while you can." Daniel nodded, but he knew he wouldn't sleep. The mountain loomed above him, an unspoken challenge. He clenched his fists, feeling the familiar fear creep into his chest. But fear was nothing new to him. He had faced it his whole life, and now he was ready to conquer it. Tomorrow, the climb would begin. Tomorrow, he would take the first step toward proving to the world and to himself that he was more than his failures. He was a man destined to touch the sky. The first steps felt easy, too easy. The air was crisp, the path well-trodden, and Daniel's heart pounded not from exertion, but from anticipation. His boots crunched against the packed snow as he followed Tenzing and the rest of the team up the trail. Everest was a beast, but for now it lay dormant beneath a vast blue sky. The group moved in unison, a small caravan of climbers from different corners of the world, each carrying their own dreams, fears, and reasons for being here. Some climbed for glory, others for redemption. Daniel climbed because he had no other choice. "Keep a steady pace," Tenzing advised. "You don't conquer Everest in a day. The mountain decides if it will let you reach the top." Daniel absorbed every word. He had read every book, watched every documentary, but nothing compared to being here, feeling the cold bite into his skin, watching the massive ice falls rise before him like frozen waves waiting to crash down at any moment. The group reached their first major challenge, the Khumbu Icefall, a treacherous landscape of shifting glaciers, deep crevasses, and towering ice seracs. It was one of the deadliest sections of the climb, where a single misstep could mean falling into an abyss. Daniel tightened his harness as Tenzing and the other Sherpas set up the ladders. Thin aluminum rungs stretched across seemingly endless voids. The first climber went across, his boots making soft, metallic clinks against the rungs. Daniel watched his hands tighten on the rope. Then it was his turn. He took a deep breath and stepped onto the ladder, feeling it sway slightly beneath his weight. The chasm below seemed endless, his heart pounded. The wind howled through the ice, a reminder of how small and fragile he was. But he focused on the next step, 1 foot, then the next. Don't look down. Halfway across, he felt his balance shift. His breath caught. A gust of wind pushed against him. His fingers gripped the guide rope so tightly they ached. He had faced fear before, but never like this. Tenzing's voice reached him from the other side. "Slow, steady. Trust yourself." Daniel swallowed hard and forced his foot forward. One more step, then another, and finally, solid ground. He let out a shaky breath as Tenzing patted his shoulder. "Good, but the mountain tests you more with every step." Daniel nodded, knowing this was only the beginning. The night at Camp 1 was brutal. The wind howled like a wounded beast, rattling the thin fabric of Daniel's tent. The temperature had plummeted to unbearable lows, and even in his thick sleeping bag, the cold seeped into his bones. Every breath was an effort, the air too thin, too sharp. He lay awake, staring at the tent ceiling, his body aching from the day's climb. His fingers trembled, his muscles burned, and the weight of Everest pressed down on him in more ways than one. Outside, the mountain was alive. Ice cracked in the distance, avalanches rumbled down unseen slopes, and the constant wind reminded him that this was no place for the weak. Tenzing's words echoed in his mind. The mountain tests you more with every step. Was he strong enough to pass the test? Doubt crept in, just as it always had. He thought of the voices from his past, the ones that had told him he was wasting his time, that he wasn't cut out for this, that he was chasing something impossible. You don't belong here. He shut his eyes and forced the thought away. Morning came slowly, the first light casting long shadows over the frozen landscape. Crawling out of his tent, he was met with a world of white and blue, an endless expanse of ice and sky. Everest stood before him, silent, unmoving, waiting. Tenzing approached, his breath visible in the frigid air. "How do you feel?" Daniel flexed his fingers, willing warmth back into them. "Like I got run over by an ice truck." Tenzing chuckled. "Good, it means you're still alive." They packed their gear and continued the ascent. The path to Camp 2 was steep, the ice unforgiving. Each step was a battle against exhaustion, against the thinning air. Daniel focused on the rhythm of his breathing. Step, inhale, step, exhale. The world shrank down to just that. Nothing else mattered, just the next step. Hours passed. The sun burned down on the snow, making it blindingly bright. Sweat dripped down Daniel's face despite the cold. His legs felt like lead. Then suddenly a sharp crack, he froze. The ice beneath his feet groaned. A fissure split the snow just inches away. Avalanche. The world roared to life. A wall of snow and ice thundered down the slope, a white tidal wave consuming everything in its path. Daniel's heart slammed against his ribs. "Move!" Tenzing's voice cut through the chaos. Instinct took over. Daniel turned and ran, his boots slipping against the treacherous terrain. The avalanche was faster, unstoppable. The ground beneath him trembled, and the air filled with ice particles so thick he could barely see. Then, impact. The force hit, like a freight train. Daniel was thrown off his feet, tumbling through the snow. The world spun, his body flipping, rolling, crashing against unseen obstacles. He fought to stay upright, to breathe, but the snow was swallowing him. This is it. The thought flickered in his mind, but he refused to accept it. He clawed against the weight of the avalanche, kicking, twisting, trying to stay above the surface. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the roar faded. The snow settled. Silence. Daniel coughed, his lungs burning. He was half buried, his right arm pinned beneath the icy debris. Panic clawed at his chest. He had to move. Now. He willed his fingers. To flex, numb but still there. Gritting his teeth, he yanked his arm free, ignoring the sharp pain that shot up to his shoulder. His body ached, but he was alive. A voice cut through the stillness. "Daniel!" Tenzing. Daniel turned toward the sound. A few meters away, Tenzing and two other climbers were digging themselves out. Relief flooded him, but they weren't safe yet. He scrambled to his feet, stumbling through the uneven snow. The avalanche had reshaped the landscape, erasing their previous path. Camp 2 was still ahead, but now the route was uncertain. Tenzing met his gaze. "We keep moving." Daniel swallowed hard and nodded. He had come too far to turn back. Now, bruised, battered, and breathless, they pressed on. The mountain had tested them once again, but Daniel wasn't ready to fall. Not yet. Every step felt heavier. The avalanche had stolen their strength, but the mountain demanded more. The path to Camp 2 was no longer clear, forcing them to navigate through an unfamiliar maze of ice and rock. The silence was eerie. No wind, no distant rumble of falling snow. Just their labored breaths and the crunch of boots against frozen ground. Daniel's legs burned with exhaustion, but he forced himself to move. The sun was beginning to set, casting long, golden shadows across the ice. They had to reach Camp 2 before nightfall. Tenzing led the way, his movements precise, deliberate. He knew this mountain like a second home. "Stay close," he warned. "The ice is unstable." Daniel nodded, gripping his trekking poles tightly. His fingers were stiff, the cold gnawing at his bones. He thought about warmth, about a home he had left behind, a life he had sacrificed for this dream. He thought about every person who had ever doubted him. If only they could see me now. Suddenly, a climber ahead of him slipped. The man let out a sharp cry as his boot lost traction, sending him skidding down an icy slope. He clawed at the ground, desperately trying to stop his descent. Daniel didn't think, he acted. He lunged forward, driving his ice axe into the ground with one hand and reaching out with the other. "Grab my arm!" he shouted. The climber's gloved hand grasped his wrist, but the momentum nearly pulled Daniel down with him. His boots glid. His heart pounded. Tenzing rushed in, driving his own axe into the ice and anchoring them both. With a coordinated effort, they hauled the climber back onto solid ground. The man collapsed onto his knees, panting. Thank you," he gasped. Daniel's arms trembled, adrenaline still surging through his veins. He locked eyes with Tenzing, who gave him a small nod of approval. "Good instincts," the Sherpa said. Daniel exhaled, barely realizing he had been holding his breath. They couldn't afford more mistakes. The mountain was merciless to those who faltered. As the last light of day faded, Camp 2 finally came into view. A cluster of tents nestled against the ice. Relief crashed over Daniel, but he knew this was just another checkpoint. Everest was far from finished with him. Tomorrow, the climb would continue. Nightfall at Camp 2 was a battle against the cold. Inside his tent, Daniel wrapped himself in every layer he had, but the chill still crept through. His breath came out in shallow clouds, barely warming the space around him. His body ached from the day's climb, but sleep refused to come. Outside, Everest was awake. The wind howled through the valley, rattling the tents, carrying with it an unsettling reminder: this mountain was alive and it did not care who came to challenge it. Daniel stared at the ceiling of his tent, exhaustion pressing down on him, but his mind was restless. He thought about the avalanche, the near fall, the relentless tests Everest kept throwing at him. But more than that, he thought about home. His father had called him a fool for chasing this dream. Mountains don't care about dreams, he had said. They swallow men whole. Maybe he was right. Daniel clenched his fists beneath the sleeping bag. He had fought too hard to let doubt creep in now. He had given up everything for this climb. He couldn't afford to fail. A voice interrupted his thoughts. "Daniel," Tenzing called, from outside. "Come." He hesitated for a moment before unzipping the tent and stepping into the frozen night. The sky was vast, endless, a black canvas scattered with a million stars. The air was razor-sharp, biting at his exposed skin. Tenzing stood at the edge of the camp, gazing up at the towering slopes of Everest. His expression was unreadable. "You hesitate," he said. Daniel stiffened. "I'm not afraid." Tenzing turned to him, eyes sharp. "Fear is not the enemy. Doubt." "Zawir," Daniel swallowed. He wanted to argue, to insist that he was sure of himself, but the words wouldn't come. Tenzing motioned toward the peak still far above them. Everest does not care about strength. It does not care about courage. It only allows those who are ready. Daniel followed his gaze, his heart pounding. The summit felt impossibly far, but he had made it this far. He would not break now. Tenzing studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Rest. Tomorrow we climb higher." Daniel exhaled and turned back toward his tent. The cold still bit at him. The wind still howled and Everest still loomed above. But something inside him had shifted. He wasn't here to prove anything to anyone else. He was here to prove something to himself. Tomorrow, he would climb. Morning came with an unforgiving wind. Daniel woke to the sound of tents flapping violently, the thin fabric barely holding against the relentless gusts. His breath was ragged, his body stiff from the cold. Every muscle ached, but there was no room for weakness. Not here. He forced himself to sit up, pulling on his gear with slow, deliberate movements. His fingers were numb even inside his gloves, and he had to flex them repeatedly just to regain sensation. The altitude was pressing down on him, making every motion feel heavier, slower. Outside, the team was already preparing to move. Tenzing stood near the edge of the camp, scanning the route ahead. The climb to Camp 3 would be brutal, steeper, colder, and with even less oxygen to breathe. Daniel tightened the straps on his pack, adjusted his mask, and joined the others. "Are you ready?" Tenzing asked, his voice calm but firm. Daniel met his gaze and nodded. He had no choice but to be ready. The ascent began. The trail ahead was a vertical nightmare. Sheer ice walls, deep crevasses, and a thin ridge where one misstep could mean falling thousands of feet. They climbed in a slow, methodical line, each step a battle against the thinning air. Daniel focused on his breathing, step Breathe in, step, breathe out. It was the only way to keep going. Hours passed. The higher they climbed, the harder it became to think, to move, to even stay awake. The lack of oxygen made his head pound, his vision blur at the edges. Then came the Lhotse face, a near vertical wall of ice stretching up toward the sky. The only way up was by using fixed ropes, inching forward with ice axes and crampons. One by one, the climbers ahead of him ascended, their figures small against the massive frozen wall. When Daniel reached the base, he hesitated. The ice was smooth, unforgiving. One slip, one mistake, and he'd fall. Tenzing's voice reached him. "Don't think, climb." Daniel swallowed hard and gripped the rope. His muscles screamed as he pulled himself upward, his ice axe finding purchase, his boots kicking into the ice for support. The wind howled. Around him, the altitude pressing on his chest like a weight. Halfway up, his strength faltered. His arms trembled. His breaths came in ragged gasps. "I can't." The thought crept in, uninvited. His body wanted to stop, to let go, to surrender to the exhaustion. Then he looked up. Tenzing was above him, waiting, watching. He wasn't going to save him. This was Daniel's battle. One more step. He forced his axe into the ice. One more pull. His foot found a hold. Slowly, painfully, he climbed, inch by inch, fighting through the doubt, through the pain. And then, solid ground. He collapsed onto the ledge, gasping, his heart hammering against his ribs. Tenzing crouched beside him, nodding approvingly. "You are learning." Daniel barely had the strength to respond, but inside something had changed. He had faced the wall, and he had won. But Everest was not done with him yet. The night at Camp 3 felt different. The wind still howled, but it no longer rattled Daniel's nerves. He had faced the Lhotse face, and though his body was battered, he had proven to himself that he could overcome the odds. The climb was far from over, but for the first time since he set foot on Everest, he felt something other than fear. The team sat around a small fire that crackled weakly in the cold, sharing what little warmth they could. The stars above were a blur, their light swallowed by the snow and the thin air. Everyone was exhausted, physically spent, but there was an unspoken bond that had formed between them. No one spoke of their personal lives, of what had brought them to this place. There was no need. They all knew the unspoken truth. Tomorrow would be even harder. Tenzing stood and gathered their attention. "Rest tonight. Tomorrow we aim for the summit. It will be the hardest day yet." Daniel nodded, though the words felt heavy. He had expected this moment to come sooner, or later, but now that it was here, he realized how little he was truly prepared for it. The summit loomed in his mind like a distant mirage, its promise of triumph just out of reach. But it was there. He crawled into his tent, curling into his sleeping bag. Despite the cold, despite the exhaustion, sleep didn't come easily. His mind raced, thoughts spinning in chaotic circles. He thought of the years he had spent dreaming of this moment, every sacrifice, every hour of training, every doubt he had ever faced. The mountain had demanded everything from him, and it had taken far more than he had expected. Was it worth it? He didn't have the answer yet, but he knew one thing for certain. He wasn't going to stop. Not now. Not when the summit was within reach. The wind grew louder as the night wore on, its biting cold creeping into every corner of his mind. But in the quiet spaces between his thoughts, Daniel found a sliver of peace. The mountain was still testing him, still pushing him to his limits, but he had learned something crucial. He could endure. Morning broke with an eerie calm. The sun was barely a sliver on the horizon, casting a pale light over the white expanse. It was the final day, the day that would decide everything. Tenzing rallied the group, giving last-minute instructions as they strapped on their gear. The air was thinner here, harder to breathe, and the weight of their packs felt like it would crush them. "We move as one," Tenzing said. No room for mistakes. The group set off, and this time there was no chatter, no casual conversation. Every step felt like a conscious decision, a deliberate action that might be the difference between life and death. The mountain had turned from a challenge into a relentless force, and now it was pushing them to the edge. Daniel moved with determination, the rhythm of his breathing steady and controlled. But as they neared the final stretch, the altitude became almost unbearable. His body screamed for oxygen, and his head throbbed with each step. He could feel his legs giving out beneath him, but somehow, he pressed on. The summit was close, too close to turn back now. Then, after what felt like an eternity, the ropes were pulled tight, and Daniel reached out, his gloved hand brushing against the summit flag. The top of the world. He had made it. For a brief, breathtaking moment, time seemed to freeze. He stood at the peak of Everest, the wind whipping around him, the vast expanse of snow stretching to infinity. The world was still, silent, as if the mountain had allowed him this victory. For a moment, it seemed like he and the peak were one. He had done it. The silence on top of Everest was deafening. Daniel stood there, his chest heaving with each labored breath, the thin air making it difficult to take in even the smallest amount of oxygen. But it didn't matter. He had reached the summit, and nothing else in the world could compare to that moment. The winds howled violently, tearing at his clothes, but he didn't care. The overwhelming sense of accomplishment surged through him, flooding his veins with a strange, unshakable peace. Tenzing stepped forward beside him, his eyes scanning the horizon. There was no need for words. They both knew the weight of this moment. The summit was not just a physical achievement. It was the culmination of years of struggle, failure, and sacrifice. But it wasn't just the victory that meant something. It was the journey. Tenzing reached out and gave Daniel a firm pat on the back. "You did it." Daniel nodded, his voice lost in the wind. The words seemed too small, too insignificant to express the emotions roiling inside him. They stood together for a while, silent and still, before Tenzing motioned toward the descent. "We are not finished yet. The mountain still tests us." Daniel nodded, snapping out of his reverie. The summit was a fleeting moment. Now they had to survive the descent, an equally treacherous part of the climb. They began their descent, carefully, step by step, knowing that Everest was unforgiving to those who let their guard down. The air was thin, and every movement became more deliberate, more cautious. But despite the weight of the descent, Daniel felt lighter. He had done what so many had only dreamed of. He had conquered Everest, and in doing so, he had conquered his own doubts, his own limitations. The climb had tested him in ways he never could have imagined, but it had given him something far more valuable, a profound understanding of his own resilience. As they neared Camp 4, the exhaustion began to weigh heavily on him again. His body was bruised, battered, and completely drained. But the feeling of accomplishment still lingered in his chest, a quiet flame that refused to be extinguished. Tenzing caught his eye, his expression hard to read beneath the layers of cold-weather gear. "You've done something most men could never even dream of," he said quietly. Daniel smiled faintly, grateful for the rare moment of acknowledgement. He didn't need more recognition. He knew the truth. He had done what many thought was impossible. He had reached the top of the world, and that was enough. The descent continued, slow and steady, each step back down the mountain just as important as the climb up. Daniel thought of the people waiting for him at home, of his father's doubt, and of how far he had come since those early days of training. And as they reached the safety of Camp 4, the weight of the journey began to settle in. The climb was over, but the lessons would stay with him forever. He had proven that he could endure, that he could push beyond what he thought was possible. And perhaps, just perhaps, that was the most important victory of all. But 10. Back at base camp, Daniel stood at the edge of the mountain, looking up at the peak he had just conquered. His legs ached, his face was wind-burned, and his eyes were heavy with exhaustion, but there was a deep sense of fulfillment in his soul. He had done it. He had reached the top of Everest. The climb was over, but it had changed him in ways he could never fully describe. It had taught him about the power of persistence, the value of believing in oneself when the odds were stacked, against you and the importance of embracing failure as a step toward success. He had learned that no matter how impossible the journey might seem, the key to achieving greatness was in the willingness to continue, to endure, and to rise above the doubts that tried to hold him back. It was a lesson that extended far beyond the mountain. It was a lesson for life. As Daniel looked back down at the base camp, he felt a deep sense of gratitude. Gratitude for the people who had supported him, for the lessons the mountain had taught him, and for the strength he had found within himself. He had faced the peak of Everest and survived, but more importantly, he had faced the peak of his own limits and conquered them. And that was the true victory. The journey down was not as easy as Daniel had hoped. Though the summit had been conquered, the real danger lay in the descent. The mountain's brutal winds and unpredictable weather still tested them at every step. The ice and snow, once silent companions, now seemed to conspire against their every move. Each step down felt more precarious than the last. The thin air left Daniel gasping for breath, his body fatigued from the climb and his mind clouded by the endless hours of cold, pain, and hunger. The joy of the summit had begun to fade, replaced by the harsh reality of survival. He thought of the moment when he had first gazed at the peak so far above, and how it had seemed so unattainable. Now, with every step he took away from it, the summit felt as though it were becoming a distant memory, a fleeting dream that had slipped through his fingers. But there was no time for nostalgia. They reached Camp 4 with heavy hearts and tired bodies. The air at this altitude was thin, and even the smallest tasks required immense effort. Daniel collapsed into his tent, his body aching in every muscle, but his mind was alert. In the quiet of the night, he found himself reflecting. Once again, what had driven him to this mountain? Was it the glory of standing at the summit? The desire to prove something to his father? Or was it something deeper? Something about the challenge, about the journey itself? He didn't have the answers, but he knew one thing for certain. The climb had changed him. He was no longer the man who had arrived at base camp weeks ago, filled with doubt and uncertainty. He was different now. He had faced the most formidable challenge of his life and survived. The next morning, the weather had shifted. A storm was approaching, and the team had no choice but to descend quickly. Daniel stood at the edge of Camp 4, looking down the steep slope that would take him further from the summit. His body was exhausted, every muscle sore, but his spirit was unwavering. They began the final leg of the descent, each step more deliberate than the last. The storm grew closer, the winds whipping through the valley like a force of nature, but Daniel kept moving forward. He was not just descending the mountain, he was descending into the man he had become. With every step, he shed the weight of doubt. With every footfall, he left behind the person who had feared failure. He was learning what it meant to be resilient, not just on the mountain, but in life itself. By the time they reached base camp, Daniel was physically spent, but his mind was clear. He had learned to trust himself. He had learned that victory wasn't just about reaching the summit. It was about the strength to face the trials, to continue even when everything seemed impossible. And now, as he looked around at the other climbers, their faces lined with exhaustion but glowing with the same shared sense of achievement, he knew that they had all been changed by this experience. Everest had taken much from them, but it had given them something even greater, a lesson in perseverance, in endurance, in the power of the human spirit. He had done it, and more than that, he had become the person he needed to be to face whatever challenges came next. Weeks later, Daniel returned home. The familiar sights of his town, his quiet neighborhood, his father's workshop, seemed almost surreal after everything he had experienced. The world felt smaller now, as though he had touched something vast, something beyond his understanding, and was now forced to return to the ordinary. His father was waiting for him, standing in the doorway with his arms crossed. The same man who had once told him he was a fool for chasing this dream now looked at him with something resembling pride, though it was hidden beneath his gruff exterior. "You made it," his father said simply. Daniel nodded. "I did." They stood there for a moment, the weight of everything between them. His father's gaze softened slightly, a silent acknowledgement passing between them. "I was wrong," his father finally muttered. "You had to prove it to yourself, not me, not anyone else." Daniel didn't know what to say. For so long he had tried to win his father's approval, tried to show him that he was capable, that his dreams were not just fantasies. But now, standing in front of him, he realized that the journey had never been about winning his father's approval. It had been about proving to himself that he could do it. "I'm proud of you, Daniel," his father said, his voice quieter now. "You're a different man than the one who left. Stronger." Daniel smiled, a weight lifting off his shoulders. He hadn't needed his father's approval all along. What mattered was that he had believed in himself, even when no one else did. Later that evening, after dinner, Daniel sat in his room, looking through the photos from his climb. He relived the moments, the struggles, the victories, and the quiet moments of reflection. And he realized something. The summit was not the end of the journey. It was just another beginning. He didn't need to climb any more mountains to prove himself. His victory was in the strength he had discovered within himself. And whatever came next, whether it was a new challenge, a new mountain to climb, or a new path to follow, he knew he would be ready. The mountain had changed him, but the man who had climbed it, he was ready for whatever came next. Months passed, and the memory of Everest slowly faded into the past, but the lessons from the climb remained as sharp as ever. Daniel's life shifted back into a routine, though something deep inside him had fundamentally changed. He no longer sought approval from others, no longer needed validation to chase his dreams. He had learned that success was not measured by external recognition. It was measured by the strength to keep moving forward, no matter what obstacles stood in the way. One afternoon, Daniel found himself standing at the base of a new challenge. It was no mountain, but it might as well have been. He had found a new passion, a cause, a project that called to him in the same way Everest had. But this time, the climb would not be physical. It would be mental, emotional. The lessons of Everest had prepared him for it. He would face whatever came next with the same determination, the same resilience, because the greatest victories aren't always the ones that happen at the top. The project Daniel had found was nothing like Everest, but it demanded something equally profound from him. His time, his focus, and a part of himself he hadn't realized was still buried deep within. It was a community initiative, a small group, working to bring renewable energy to remote villages. The challenge was immense, navigating bureaucracy, securing funding, and convincing people who had lived in the shadows of progress for generations that change was possible. It was a mountain of its own, a climb of a different sort. As he sat in meetings with the team, listening to the uphill struggles they faced, Daniel couldn't help but draw comparisons to his climb on Everest. Just like the mountain, the project seemed insurmountable at times. The obstacles were numerous, the hurdles high, and the risks vast. But it wasn't about the fear anymore. It wasn't about being daunted by the task ahead. It was about applying everything he had learned on that icy peak in the Himalayas. With every setback, he reminded himself that there would be no summit without the struggle, no breakthrough without the hardship. Just like on Everest, it wasn't about avoiding failure. It was about learning from it and moving forward, no matter how slow or painful the journey. Daniel found himself working tirelessly, organizing fundraising events, negotiating with government officials, and tirelessly engaging with the communities